So the slides I'm going to show this evening are all available on Canvas. So I'm not going to talk through all the slides. That doesn't make any sense. You can all read. What I thought I would do, though, is talk about some features of motivation that are sometimes misunderstood or perhaps less than obvious. So that's my goal for tonight. It's the kind of stuff you don't tend to read about in the book, and it's the kind of stuff that, again, is a bit perhaps a bit less than obvious. So let me kind of get started here. And the one thing about motivation that most people have heard about it at some point in their lives is what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so as a quick reminder of this, because you almost all must have had this at some course at some point in your life, Maslow proposed that humans have a hierarchy of needs, starting off with kind of very basic needs that are physiological, kind of hunger, stuff like that, and then proceeding upward to kind of being safe and secure, and then social, and then developing a sense of esteem, and then finally this term he coined called self-actualization, kind of becoming all that you're capable of becoming. And Maslow's idea was that these things exist in a hierarchy, and that unless all the needs at the bottom are currently fulfilled, people don't pay attention to the needs at the top of the hierarchy. So, if your physiological and safety needs aren't being taken care of, then you don't care about social needs or love or esteem or anything else. That was the basic idea. And everybody kind of remembers that. And what I want to point out is, despite the fact that everybody remembers it, in work settings, there's almost no research that is supportive of Maslow's model. Maybe counterintuitive because it's taught so much, but there's almost no evidence that that's the way things work in work settings. There's no evidence that in work settings we have 5 distinct needs. There's no evidence that only one need dominates the others. And in the end, the model doesn't provide much useful guidance. So I think the chapter does a much better job at that, and these slides, I think, do a better job of that. And so that's what we're going to cover. And I'm just going to cover some of these. Again, I don't want to go through all the details because, again, you can read this stuff yourself. But I do want to talk about some stuff that's commonly misunderstood. So we're going to start off with the concept of goals. And I want to, some kind of what are called superordinate goals, not really mentioned in the book. These are kind of very high-level kind of goals, but they're often very abstract. Okay. The famous John Kennedy quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." It sounds like a great political thing to say. It might be a great thing to say and believe and do, but the bottom line is it's quite abstract. Martin Luther King saying, "I have a dream," that's still often quite abstract, right? So let me talk about kind of the key thing with goals. And let me just flip ahead by one slide here. Everybody on the planet has seen this, what's called the SMART goal acronym. The idea that goals should be specific, measurable, attainable. Some people say they should be achievable. That's okay. Some people say they should be accepted. Whatever you want A to stand for is fine. They should be relevant and realistic, and they should have a time frame attached with them. But here's the ironic thing: even though everybody knows about that, the single most in the research, and there have been way over 1,000 peer-refereed studies published on goal setting, almost all of which were published from real-world work settings. They weren't lab studies. It's clear that, yeah, it's really important that goals be specific. I absolutely agree with that. It's certainly important that they be accepted. Otherwise, then people really don't have a goal if they haven't accepted it. But the biggest thing you find in goal setting is that if goals are going to lead to higher performance, they should be difficult. And notice that that's not in the SMART acronym at all. So if I were going to recommend 2 things that you want to do with goals, I want number 1 to be that they need to be very specific, and that means they can be measured. And number two is that they're difficult. Now, they shouldn't be impossible. If people perceive a goal as impossible, they don't even bother to try. But difficult goals consistently lead to higher levels of performance than moderately difficult goals or easier goals. So it's really important to kind of keep that concept in mind, because it's not in the SMART acronym. Yet it ought to be the most important thing there. So that was kind of one point I wanted to bring about. And I thought I would just share a great example of a specific goal. You know, John Kennedy in 1962 could have said that the goal of the United States was to be the highest quality space exploration industry in the world. But that's not what he said. He said a famous quote in 1962. He said, "We will put a man on the moon within this decade and return him safely to Earth." And I can assure you, because I was alive in 1962, although I was just a young kid, but I can assure you that when John Kennedy said, "We will put a man on the moon within this decade and return him safely to Earth," almost everybody thought he was nuts or he was kidding. Of course, as you might know, we actually did that. An example of a very difficult goal and one that's very specific. And at the time, people really did think it was crazy, but we did it. We did it. Good example of kind of combining specificity with goal difficulty. Now, so those are my main points about goals, but I do want to share one other thing, and that's about the number of goals. So many of you may work in organizations where you're asked to set goals. That's pretty common. We're asked to do that at LaSalle. I've done a bunch of consulting in the arena of performance management with different organizations, and almost all of them ask people to set goals regardless of their levels. And in some places are crazy about this, and so they expect people, I'm not making this up, to set 15 or 20 goals. I once did some consulting for a company. It's a global consumer products company, and I'll leave it at that, where the CEO, the first time they started using goals, he wrote goals for the business for the next year, and he thought, well, then everybody else will build off my goals. It's a very common way of thinking. And as I recall, he wrote 55 goals. And now, some of those goals only apply to certain parts of the business, but it created a circumstance where a lot of people had 20, 25 goals for the year. The bottom line is that's nuts. And the reason why it's nuts is because one of the main things that goals are designed to do is to focus attention. And when you set too many goals, people lose focus. Most people who've studied this literature say, you know, the right amount of goals is probably someplace in the area of 3 or 4 to 7 or 8. So if you're working with someplace that's setting more than that, you should be cautious. You know, because the goals should be really things that are designed to focus your attention and focus your energy. I don't mean that you're only doing 8 things over the year. Of course, you're doing way more than that. But what are the big goals? They need to be limited in number. They need to be limited in number. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, I'm going to skip this piece on commitment. Again, you can read this. As I said, this will be one of the things you can read on your own. I want to talk about the concept of self-efficacy. And I want to explain what it means. So first I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to try to clarify it. So self-efficacy is your belief that you can perform a specific task successfully. Let me say that again. It's your belief that you can perform a specific task successfully. Self-efficacy is not about self-esteem. Self-esteem is kind of a general evaluation or feeling we have about our own worth in the world. That's not what self-efficacy is at all. Self-efficacy is very much about looking at a specific task and saying, can I do that successfully? And it's not a question of whether or not you can. It's a question of whether or not you believe you can. So So the idea here is, do I believe that I can achieve this goal, achieve this task, if I exert the effort? And a good deal of research suggests that this self-efficacy belief is often as important as your actual ability. Because if you don't believe you can do it, you won't exert the effort. I also want to clarify that self-efficacy is, again, very task specific. So all of you who are listening right now, I am positive that there are some things that you have very high levels of self-efficacy about. I'm also positive that there are some things in your life where you probably don't have much self-efficacy. I tend to have very high self-efficacy in some arenas. I've done a lot of leadership coaching in my life in the last 15 years. I have pretty high self-efficacy about that. I've always been pretty good at statistics, including advanced kind of doctoral level statistics. And some of that stuff gets pretty crazy, but I have a high self-efficacy about it. And my sense is, if I had to learn a statistical analytic technique that I don't now know, my self-efficacy is high. I believe I could do that. I've learned enough so far that I'm really confident I could learn that. But I have low self-efficacy about other things. Great examples for me are I have low self-efficacy about anything mechanical. Repairing my car, plumbing, electrical work, even at simple levels, I just have no self-efficacy. I always want to have somebody else do that stuff. And I don't believe that if I worked hard at it, I could probably learn it. I have a similar low self-efficacy about learning another language. I've tried a couple times to learn French, Spanish, and I've always struggled, and I've given up eventually. So when people have high levels of self-efficacy, they tend to set more challenging goals for themselves. We already know that that leads to higher performance. And when they face a setback, they persevere. If I'm learning a new statistical technique, imagine I had to learn latent growth curve modeling technique I can read about, but I don't really know how to do it in the granular level. You know what would happen if something went wrong and I ran the software and it didn't go, or I couldn't figure it out? I would persevere. I would keep going because I'm thinking I can figure this out. But when I'm learning a new language or trying to learn a new language, once I start to run into a lot of trouble, I start to give up. And if you have high self-efficacy, if you get negative feedback, you actually work harder. But when you have low self-efficacy, if you get negative feedback, you work less hard. You exert less effort. Notice this has nothing to do with actual ability. And I see this all the time with students. Students who feel like, I can't do that. And right off the bat, they're kind of turning their brains off on that task. And in fact, I believe they can do it. But they don't believe they can, and so they don't exert effort. Okay? So one big thing here is, what do you do about that? If you're the boss, if you're the manager, and you've got an employee, how do you deal with that? And one example of that is to break apart a complicated task and give the workers one part at a time, especially if you can sequence each part so that they get progressively more difficult. And I'll tell you a very quick 1-minute story about this. A guy I was doing some leadership coaching with about 6 years ago or so, worked for a global pharmaceutical company, and he was transferred to head up a new group of people in the company. This is a very smart guy, PhD. He was director level, very impressive guy. And this new group had a lot of people in it who had degrees, undergraduate degrees in chemistry or biology, mostly chemistry. They did not have a good reputation as a group, and his job was to try to turn them around. And right off the bat, there was a woman in the group who was pretty quiet, who he kind of looked at her work and thought it was pretty good, but she seemed to be kind of quiet and a bit timid. And he wanted her to build confidence in front of an audience. And he thought about how would he do that, because she seemed really timid and lacked confidence. So what he did is he would have a meeting each week with his team. It wasn't a long meeting. It was just a 1-hour meeting. I think it was on Monday mornings. And what he would do is he would before each of those meetings, like the end of the week before that, he'd sit down with this woman and he'd say, I want to ask you to help me prepare for Monday morning's team meeting. And she said, oh, okay. And he'd ask her to put together some stuff, pull together some facts, and make some PowerPoint slides out of them. And then for the first couple of weeks, that's kind of what he did. And of course, he would do the presentation himself, but the content on at least some of these PowerPoint slides came from her, not from him. And so after a couple of weeks, he said to her, you know, you actually know this content better than I do. You're the one who put it together. Could you just do me a favor for 10 minutes of the meeting, and when we get to these 2 or 3 slides, could you just talk everybody through those? It would be a big help. She was like, oh, I guess I could do that. And you can see where this is going. He kind of gradually built this up to the point where she was planning the meetings and putting together the agenda. And then he started bringing her to the meetings with his boss, who was a vice president, and there would usually be 10 or 15 directors in the meeting, and she'd just kind of sit and listen. He asked her to take notes at the beginning, and then eventually he said, you know, could you do me a favor? I have to make a presentation for the VP next week. You've been attending the meetings. Could you help me by putting some slides together? You can see where this is going. And she wound up doing that. And he kind of kept doing this process until about 3 or 4 months after he started. She was actually making presentations to the vice president. Huh? Stunning. But she would have been terrified to do that at the beginning. It was a great example of how to take a complicated, large task, break it apart one at a time, and allow the person to build self-efficacy by letting them accomplish successively more difficult tasks. So that's kind of one of the key things about that. I wanted to briefly talk about reinforcement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There are only 2 things I want to talk about here. I have heard people use the term reinforcement wildly incorrectly. So I'll give you an example. I was doing some consulting. This was a long time ago, probably, I bet you it was 20 years ago. And it was with a bank. And it was through LaSalle, actually. Somebody at LaSalle asked me to help these people out. And I was helping them do some work around training. And during that, I had a chance to meet a number of branch managers. Folks who run a local branch, and a typical branch might have, in this place, they might have at any time of the day, they might have 6 or 7 people working there. I was talking about reinforcement with people, and at one point, this one branch manager said, well, one thing I do to reinforce my staff and try to encourage them is every either Monday morning or Friday morning, I stop at Dunkin' Donuts on the way in, and I get those big boxes. I think they call them Cup of Joes. I'm not sure about that. You've seen them before. And I pick up a couple dozen donuts, and I put them in the break room, and I tell everybody that they're there, and this is my way of saying, you know, thanks for all you do, and please, you know, enjoy the donuts and enjoy the coffee. That's a great thing to do. It's a very kind thing to do. It's not reinforcement. It's not reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means that you're only reinforcing people or an individual if they accomplish a specific task. Huh? If they accomplish a specific task. So just being nice is not a reinforcer. A reinforcer is when we say, listen, whatever reward or recognition you're giving, it's contingent on performance. You only get it if the performance occurs, the desired performance. That's not what was happening with this branch manager. She was really nice. I applauded her for doing what she was doing, but she was confused because positive reinforcement means I reward or recognize you if you accomplish a specific task, if your performance merits this reward or recognition. Just being nice once a week is a great thing to do, but it's not a reinforcement. Because if you want to shape behavior, all the evidence says you need to make reinforcers contingent on specific performance. So I encourage people to be nice all the time. It's a wonderful thing to do. It's a great thing if you're a boss. People will like you for it, and I love it. I think it's great. What a terrific thing to do. When I've been a department chair and stuff, I've done that. When I was a manager in corporate life for years, I don't know how much I did that or not, to tell you the truth. I did it occasionally, but I don't think I did it enough. But I was pretty good about rewarding or recognizing only when a specific performance that I had talked about with the group or with the individual had occurred. And at that point, I would look for some way of recognizing that performance. So I'll give you a quick example of that, and then I'll move on. Years ago, I was in corporate life, and I was on a special project working for a guy who was kind of director, VP level. He was he was at executive level in AT&T's compensation scheme. Well, it wasn't like real high executive, but he was definitely executive level. And he'd asked me to help out on a corporate-wide project, and I've been working on it for a few months, and along with some other people, but I've been working really hard on it. And I came into work one Monday morning, and I opened my office, and I always kept my desk really clean, and there was an envelope on my office that had my name on it. Just weird, because I had closed the office and locked it on on Friday at probably 6 or 6:30 in the evening. And I open up the envelope, and it's a handwritten note from this vice president, whose name was John. Great guy. And I don't remember the specific wording of the note, but it said something like, "Hi, Jim. I want to thank you for all the work you've been doing for the past few months. You've accomplished a lot. You did X, and you did Y, and you did Z, and the team has made a lot of progress, and you've really contributed to that. And so I really want to thank you for that. And just as a small way of saying thanks, what I'd like you to do is, because I know you've spent a lot of evenings here and not with your family, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take your wife out to dinner. I want you to pick one of the nicest restaurants in the North Jersey, New York area. I want you to go there. You decide where. Order a great bottle of wine when you get there, and order a great meal, just phenomenal meal. Okay, and when it's all done, don't even think about price. When it's all done, just send me the bill, and I'll take care of it. Thanks again, John. That's a good example of reinforcement, because that reward was contingent on performance. And on top of that, so he wasn't just being nice, he was doing it because of what I'd done. And on top of that, he was really good about thinking, what would I find reinforcing? Yeah? And we often assume that people will find reinforcing if you're the one giving the reinforcement, you tend to think, well, other people will find reinforcing whatever I find reinforcing, but that's not necessarily true. But he did a really nice job of thinking, this guy has been away from his wife a bunch of different evenings. And this might be a really nice thing to do. I'm going to give him as much latitude as possible, but this way his wife will also experience this reinforcement. Smart and savvy thing to do. One other thing I want to say about reinforcement, again, you can read most of this, but I do want to talk about the downsides of punishment. And there are just tons of problems with the use of punishment in work organizations. I'm not arguing that we never punish poor performance. Please don't misunderstand me. We're going to be talking about managing poor performance next week, and there will be a session on that, a synchronous session. But the bottom line is most supervisors aren't very good at it. We tend to give some people more leeway than others. We're often uncomfortable doing it, so we hesitate taking disciplinary action, and then eventually when we do, we're really upset, and we're overreacting to something. And over time, if you ever worked for a boss who just was constantly negative and kind of had punishment as a basic style. I worked for somebody a few years back at LaSalle that way, who's no longer at LaSalle. But people just get used to it and they ignore it. They just ignore it, And the bottom line is punishment requires that you monitor somebody's behavior pretty carefully. And so what people learn to do is they just learn to follow the rules when you're around, but otherwise they say to heck with it. And the easiest way to do that is for them to avoid you, which is the last thing you need them to do. And a considerable amount of effort, a considerable amount of research has demonstrated, especially in the last 10 years, that when employees are induced to feel angry because they believe the punishment was unfair, that often produces some form of sabotage or retaliation on the part of the employee. And even if they get better in the short run, this anger or apathy or resentment or frustration has long-term consequences. So the focus in motivation clearly needs to be on positive reinforcement, not on punishment. So we're going to be talking about feedback next week. And you'll be reading about that and doing an assignment on it. So we're going to skip over that a little bit. And I want to close, so I'm not taking a lot of your time here, and I'm doing this deliberately. I want to close by talking about, whoops, uh, by talking about intrinsic motivation. So most of what I've talked about up until now involves ways that we try to motivate people that are outside of them. Setting goals, reinforcement, enhancing their sense of self-efficacy. That's all great stuff. Absolutely true. Large body of research says this stuff works. But the biggest thing that works, and I hope that most of you feel this way about your own job, is if you're lucky enough to have a job where you feel intrinsically motivated. That is to say, you do it because you really like it. One way this is sometimes described is that some people have a job, some people have a career, and some people have a calling. I don't know which one of those three categories you'd put yourself in. A job is you're only doing it for extrinsic reasons. I'm just doing it to make the money and get by. A career is you're often doing it because you see it as a path that you'd like to pursue over a long period of time, and it could be potentially attractive. And so it might be of long-run benefit to you, and it may be helpful to others as well. But a calling is something that is very intrinsic. You feel you have a passion for doing this. I really like doing this. I want to do this. This makes me feel good to do this. I come into work and I feel like even if it's a bad day, I still feel like I'm doing something that's really useful. When I was young, I was a rehabilitation counselor, and I worked with adults, usually with psychiatric or cognitive disabilities. And I won't go into details about that, but I started off as a counselor. I had my certification in that area, later became a manager of other counselors, and then later became a director of an entire rehabilitation program, and then later became an executive director of another agency, a nonprofit agency. And so I spent a chunk of my life doing that. And when I was doing that work, I have to say that pay wasn't good, but I had a calling. I felt like this mattered. And when we did something right, few things were as satisfying. And I mention this because you can destroy intrinsic motivation by being a jerk, but it's really hard to create it. But one way you can destroy intrinsic motivation is to micromanage people, to give them insufficient latitude about how to do the job, about how to do the work. You may have worked for somebody who's done this, or you may have been guilty of it yourself. When you wind up doing everything yourself and you're uncomfortable delegating to others, they see that, and that often destroys their intrinsic motivation, because the message that they're getting is, you don't trust me. You don't think I'm capable of doing this. And so you want to do everything. And in the end, people lose their intrinsic motivation. They don't have a chance to do anything interesting and engaging. So this idea of intrinsic motivation is really powerful, and I kind of leave with the idea that you can destroy it, but it's hard to create it. And so as a final story to reinforce that, I will tell you a story that I hope will drive home this idea, and then we'll call it a night. So here's that story. This is a story told to me by one of my doctoral advisors. I have no idea if it's true or ever was true, or if it's just a really clever apocryphal story. But the story goes that there was a guy who owned a store decades ago in Brooklyn, and it was kind of a tough neighborhood. And one day some kids who were really tough kids, everybody knew they were tough, and everybody in the neighborhood was scared of them. They started playing baseball out in front of this guy's store. And nobody would walk past them to go into the store. So nobody was shopping in the guy's store, and he wasn't making any money. And he was trying to figure out what to do about that. And he goes, I hope to see it. So, and at the end of the second day, again, almost nobody's shopping in his store. And he goes out to the kids and he says, again, I want to thank you, and I'd also like to pay you a little bit for doing this. And hardly anybody came into the store the last couple of days, so I don't have much money, but I would like to give each one of you $2, and I really you'll come back tomorrow. And so again, they go, all right. So they come back tomorrow. So now they're back the third day, right? And he says to them at the end of the third day, he says, "Boy, thanks again for being here. I think it's great, and I hope you guys will come back tomorrow. I haven't had anybody coming in the store for the past 3 days, so unfortunately, I don't have any money to pay you with, but I still really hope you'll come back tomorrow, and would really appreciate that." And the kids looked at him and they said, "Hey, buddy, if you're not going to pay us, we're not going to play." And so that's a great example where originally they were just playing because they apparently enjoyed playing. They didn't know they were going to get paid. And then he started paying them for a task that they originally found intrinsically engaging. And but then they got used to the idea that maybe they're doing the task because the task here is playing baseball. Maybe they're doing it because they're getting paid $5, $3, whatever. And then suddenly there's no pay, and they went, well, screw you, we're not doing it. And it's a good example where he had cleverly used the idea that he knew how to destroy that intrinsic interest in the game, and that was to replace the intrinsic interest with pay. And then once there was no pay, they're not going to play. Well, at least they're certainly not going to play there. And so I always say it's a good thing to keep in mind about intrinsic motivation. You can kill it, but it's hard to create it. But you can create an environment where people can feel engaged. But more often than not, it's people kill it by being bad managers. So I wanted to leave you with that final thought. So that's our show for this evening, as the expression goes. It's exactly, I think we were 32 minutes here, and I think you'll find these slides really useful when it comes to, I encourage you to look at them, when it comes to doing the homework that's due Sunday. As a final point, for those of you who are with us tonight, I want to remind you that the skills analysis paper, which is the most difficult, longest, most complex, and most heavily weighted paper in the entire course, is due Friday. Due Friday night, midnight. So if you haven't been thinking about that, important to do that. I hope you all have a great evening, and I'll look forward to talking to you next week. Have a good evening, everybody.